Hello, my name's Anaya, and today I'm going to be discussing a critical tension within the UN multilateral system, which is climate financing and the North-South divide. Given that COP29 is currently underway in Baku, Azerbaijan, I thought this was a really prevalent issue to discuss. And this presentation is going to explore the underlying tensions, the progress, and the potential future directions that the UN may take to address this challenge. So, to start off by identifying what this core tension is, the North-South divide refers to the socioeconomic and political disparity between industrialized, wealthier nations that are primarily located in the global North and developing poorer nations that we primarily find in the global South. This divide manifests itself in numerous ways, but has particular negative implications regarding climate change. So, although climate change is a global issue, there is disparity between northern and southern regions in regard to both their contributions to climate change and the impacts that it brings to countries in the region. So, industrialized nations in the global north are the largest historical contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, having developed their economies through resource exploitation and fossil fuels. As you can kind of see in this graphic on the screen, cumulative CO2 emissions are very red in these northern countries. The global south, despite contributing far less to climate change historically, disproportionately suffers from the impacts, such as rising sea levels, droughts, and other extreme weather events. So, though it bears the brunt of these impacts, these countries often lack the resources necessary to adapt or to mitigate these effects. So, overall, climate financing remains underfunded, and it has become a focal point for this divide. The North has committed to providing financial support to developing countries, but the debate persists between what a fair share would look like in terms of finance. The South believes that the North is indebted to them and that developed countries need to pay their environmental and ecological dues to these countries from what they have suffered. They believe that the North doesn't acknowledge fully the extent of the inequities and how vulnerable the global South is to climate change. There's also concern that money is going towards the wrong thing, so looking more towards climate innovation when there are actual urgent impacts that are not being addressed. So overall, the debate around climate financing remains unresolved and as a whole is significantly underfunded, which is super concerning, um, considering the prevalence of this issue. Moving on to historical context. So the roots of the North-South divide can be based or tracked back to colonial exploitation and just the unequal development that followed after the Industrial Revolution. This history created a global economy where the global North advanced at the expense of the global South, mainly by exploiting resources found in these regions. So although there has been many advancements, as you can see in the timeline that I've included on this slide, I did just want to point out three main ones that I want to discuss. So the Rio Earth Summit, COP15, and the 2015 Paris Agreement. So the global community formally recognized the issue um, of this disparity in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit when it introduced the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR. It's basically recognized that nations must tackle climate change together, but developed countries do bear greater responsibility due to their historical emissions. Then we have COP15, which was the pledge of $100 billion annually for climate finance by 2020. And then the Paris Agreement, which we all know, basically bound signatories to work toward limiting global warming, um, preferably to 1.5 degrees. These are really landmark initiatives, but they have yet to fully address the funding gaps or the equity concerns that we are discussing. So now to move on to key stakeholders and their positions. First, we have the global north. Obviously, this comprises of developed nations in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. These countries often lead in technology and financial resources, but they face internal political debates over climate spending. Then the global south, which includes nations across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. These countries are demanding equitable finance to adapt and mitigate climate impacts. Moving on to non-state actors, we have activists, NGOs, including Oxfam, Climate Action Network. They all advocate for equity and they also watch to ensure transparency and accountability in these multilateral frameworks. And then we also have private corporations. Lastly, there's UN bodies such as the UNFCCC, which we'll talk about, the IPCC, and UNEP, which all provide frameworks for negotiation and funding. There's obviously still challenges that persist in their effectiveness. So, how has the UN tried to mitigate this problem? I have listed a few important um, initiatives and mechanisms that have been established by the UN. I'm going to talk about a few of them. So, starting with the COP, which I just mentioned, the COP29 is currently underway, and we're waiting for the outcome of that conference still. But these conferences basically allow for global discourse on policy, adaptation, and finance. And they've successfully raised awareness and security or the insecurity in like things like the Paris Agreement, but ultimately they haven't met financial promises that they strive for. And there's also gridlock negotiations that highlight the persistent challenges that arise when you try to address the North-South inequities. Hopefully, a good outcome will be achieved this year, as there has been word that delegates are supposed to sign off on funding that could look like anywhere from a few hundred billion to over $1 trillion per year for climate finance. Next up, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, the 2015 Paris Agreement that did provide framework for nations to submit their determined contributions. But since it was very voluntary, there was a lack of legal binding and enforcement mechanisms, which has led to inconsistent implementation. And many developing nations are still undersupported in terms of financial and technological aid. The Green Climate Fund mobilized financing for vulnerable nations, but it hasn't reached the necessary scale that's needed to adequately address global needs, and access to these funds can sometimes be complex and complicated for least developed countries to reach. And moving on to the Adaptation Fund and the Loss and Damage Fund. The Adaptation Fund was launched under the Kyoto Protocol. It has actually funded over 130 projects, but funding does remain insufficient, and mitigation is prioritized over adaptation, kind of like I mentioned earlier. And then the Loss and Damage Fund, this was from COP27. It is a promising step toward addressing disaster recovery needs in developing nations, but its operational details are a little vague and unclear. So overall, these mixed results do highlight the urgency for reform to build, but we just need to build trust and scale up these efforts. Definitely shows that there has been efforts made to mitigate the issues, but effectiveness is slightly unclear. So now moving on to the broad implications. There are a lot of broader implications, mainly in regards to global governments and climate action itself from this divide. Unmet financing commitments does deepen distrust between regions, which threatens not only the legitimacy of the UN, but also the success of the SDGs, in particular SDG 13, which addresses climate action. And as we have seen more recently, regional bodies such as the African Union, ASEAN, and the European Union have increasingly stepped up to address climate issues and other global challenges. So this showcases the potential for localized solutions, but it also highlights a shift in power dynamics that could threaten the UN's legitimacy. In terms of climate change itself, this divide and the inability to create effective frameworks for change is only worsening our climate crisis, and this is getting increasingly worse for vulnerable regions, as the delays in adaptation and mitigation projects could be catastrophic for them and undermines the efforts to protect them, or to protect those who are most at risk. At this point, it is still technically possible that the world could achieve its ambitious goals in regards to climate change, but the reality is that we will not be able to make these drastic measures unless this divide is somehow sorted out and we can move forward as a collective. So some solutions and possible conclusions to this, starting off with scaling up finance commitments. Developed countries need to significantly increase their financial contributions to meet and exceed the pledge that was set in 2020 of $100 billion annually, these goals may become even more ambitious with COP29 and they are trying to mobilize trillions by 2030 to support clean energy, climate adaptation, and disaster recovery in developing nations. So stepping up is definitely going to be crucial in meeting these goals. Second, decentralizing funds. Vulnerable communities may find it easier to access funds if they are decentralized and they don't have to overcome the barriers present in the current system. There is research that shows that these um, bureaucratic inefficiencies and the conditions imposed by international funding does make it harder for local authorities to access funds in a timely manner. So by kind of breaking down this framework, local vulnerabilities um, can be addressed quicker and they can actually get down to the people who need it and these vulnerable populations in a quicker manner. Third, prioritizing grants over loans will reduce the financial burden on developing countries. So when financing is offered as loans rather than grants, this significantly increases the debt burden for nations that are already vulnerable. And this issue is exacerbated by the fact that climate investments are difficult and they require a lot of upfront investment, which they may not be able to see substantial returns from that right away, which only makes it difficult for struggling nations to invest. Lastly, amplifying the Southern voice is going to be crucial. Communication is obviously key in all global issues. Um, but as we know, the framework of the UN is not particularly designed to amplify the non P5 voices. So communication is going to have to go a long way in easing this tension, making sure voices are heard, and then establishing effective solutions based on um, what is said. So these conclusions, while challenging, are necessary for meaningful progress. To wrap it up, the North and South divide in climate financing is a significant barrier to achieving global climate goals. And while progress has been made, there's still much to do in terms of funding, equity, and trust building. Thank you all for listening.